Hi guys, Olive here today to talk to you about the books that I read in January 2023. I'll start off by talking about all the fiction books that I finished during the month of January. There were only 2 of them, so they were few, but they were mighty. I really enjoyed both of them. This first one that I'm going to talk to you about, it's a candidate for a top book of the year, and we are just getting started with 2023. That book is White Oleander by Janet Fitch. This book was so far away from what I expected it to be. I'm not even really sure what I expected out of this book. I knew going in that it was an Oprah Book Club selection from way back in the day. I knew a lot of people liked this, and I knew that it involved the American foster care system. But beyond that, I didn't really know what I was in for. So this is all about the main character, Astrid. When she is still a very young girl, her mother is arrested and then convicted of murdering a former lover who had rejected her. Her mother took it poorly and killed this man. So she is sent to prison, and Astrid is hurled into the American foster care system. She's tossed around from home to home, trying to figure out how to survive, trying to grow up basically on her own. And then when she does get older, she's trying to figure out what role she wants her imprisoned mother to have in her life. The writing in this book is intoxicating. There's really no better way for me to put that. Astrid, the main character, her mother, Ingrid is her name. She's a poet, and you can feel the traces of Astrid's upbringing in the language that she uses to describe the world around her. It is beautiful. It is as delicate as it is brutal. I can see why Oprah picked this. I can see why everyone has fallen in love with it in the way that they do. If you have not yet read this and you've been considering it, I really urge you to pick it up. It is that good. But the other fiction book I read during the month of January, I wasn't surprised at all that I ended up enjoying because it's an Edith Wharton novel, and I love Edith Wharton. During the month of January, I read The Children, which is the story of a man, a bachelor, who accidentally meets this very eclectically connected group of children and then tries to help them in their efforts to stay together as a unit, even as he himself is becoming increasingly confused about what he wants and where he belongs. This was probably the easiest Edith Wharton novel I've read thus far in terms of the density of the prose. If you've ever read a Wharton novel, she can come on a little strong sometimes, and like how thick she's laying it on. I remember when I was reading The Age of Innocence for the very first time, which I think was my first Wharton novel, the prose reminded me of like a thick icing. Like she was really spreading it on there. It's gorgeous, but it can sometimes be a little bit hard to tackle, especially if you're not used to her. This one was a lot more digestible. She did sneak in some gorgeous descriptions in here because she's Edith Wharton, but I think if you're looking for a place to start, this wouldn't be a bad idea. If you are going to start reading Edith Wharton novels, however, you will need to prepare yourself to read about some monstrously unlikable characters. And I'm not just talking about this book, I'm talking about all of her books. I'm not sure she enjoyed writing about good people. I think she enjoyed plucking characteristics from the world that she saw around her, people she saw around her, and then putting them into these absolutely detestable people in her novels and then making those people suffer. Maybe it was cathartic for her, but that's what her books are all about. And in this book, those unlikable characters run the gamut. There are high-class people who treat children like fashion accessories, and then there's the main character, Martin, who is a toxic bachelor with a god complex, and his confusion about where he fits in between the worlds of old New York and new New York. It gets downright weird by 21st century standards. I got what Edith Wharton was trying to say about that character and where he fits in the world. I understood what she was trying to communicate, but it is not entirely comfortable to read. It's also very tragic, as all of her books tend to be. I initially thought that the inclusion of children, even in the title of this book, would potentially mean we could avoid that outcome. But that wasn't the case. It seems like one of life's great inevitabilities at this point. Death, taxes, bad times to be had for everyone inside an Edith Wharton novel. Despite all that, don't let me talk you out of trying Edith Wharton novels. They are still highly enjoyable. I don't know how she does that. Everyone's miserable by the end, but you've had a good time. Maybe because some of them deserve to suffer. But I really did enjoy reading this, even through those more uncomfortable moments. I actually read this entire thing in my circle over on the Threadable app. The whole book is over there. So if you want to read the book yourself and read some of my comments and our chats in the margins, I'll put a link to where you can join up and read that in the description box below. But then moving into all of my nonfiction reads of the month, the first one that I wanted to gush about is called Love and Justice, a story of triumph on two different courts by Maya Moore Irons and Jonathan Irons. This is the story of how one of the greatest WNBA players of all time stepped away from her basketball career to help overturn the guilty verdict of an innocent man in prison. To Maya Moore, Jonathan Irons started out just as a friend of the family, someone who her godparents were trying to help out of a really bad situation. He was in prison at the time, but then the two of them met and gradually became friends, but then they slowly and secretly fell in love. And in this book, they tell their own individual stories, and then they go on to tell their combined story of finding love and finding justice. Because after 23 years of being wrongfully imprisoned for a crime that he did not commit, Jonathan was released in 2020. The book can be very harrowing at times, especially during Jonathan's sections, just hearing everything that he had to do to survive in prison, which is a very, very challenging place. He was in prison when he was very young, so he had to learn so much about just how to survive inside of those walls. But then it's also unbelievably inspiring. All the work that Jonathan did to better himself, to learn about the law, to learn more about his case, to do everything he needed to do to try to exonerate himself. And then at the same time, you're hearing about all the work that Maya Moore did to perform at an elite level, and she was still performing insanely well on the court as she's also trying to balance this new relationship with Jonathan and also trying to free him. It's just incredible to read about. This could be infuriating to read at times, especially hearing how hard the state worked to keep this man locked up when there was evidence clear as day that he did not do this. But their story, their individual stories, and then their story together, it is so incredibly beautiful and so moving. I felt so privileged to be able to get to read their story. I'm actually really hoping to write about this book. I'm not convinced I'm going to have time, but I'm really going to try. I have so much I would like to say about it, especially as a WNBA fan, but I'll keep you posted on that. In the meantime, if you liked Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson, consider making this your next read. I was also thrilled during the month of January to be able to give a reread to one of my all-time favorite nonfiction books, The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. It being the turn of the year and everything, it seemed like a good idea to hit the refresh button on this one in my brain, and rereading it did just that. Just in case you've never heard me speak about this book before, it's about the science of habits, where habits live in our brains, how they're created, broken, replaced with different habits, and then all of that science, all of that psychology is backed up by some really interesting anecdotes. You get to hear about everything from how the song Hey Ya by Outkast was essentially manufactured into a radio hit, and how the Febreze air refresher product went from being a dud to flying off the shelves. As I was rereading this book, I was really pleased with how much I remembered from it. I know, especially after it's been a really long time since we've read a book, it can be easy to forget a lot of the things that happen in it. I remembered a lot from this book, but there were some smaller details that had definitely fallen through the cracks. So it was great to have those reinforced in my brain, especially as I'm thinking a lot about my own habits these days. But also, I'm so glad I reread this because it reinforced the idea in my head that this is an amazing book and I love recommending it. I've now been on booktube for over 8 years. I've been pushing nonfiction on this platform for pretty much that entire time. And I always feel like I'm fighting this notion that people can sometimes get about nonfiction, that it's supposed to be hard or intimidating, demanding of you. If you want to read those types of nonfiction books, that's amazing, but that's not all that nonfiction is. That's not all that it has to offer. It can be fun, engaging, while being informative. And this book is proof positive of that. This is my Swiss Army knife recommendation. This is one of the only nonfiction books that I recommend everyone should read. I also read Sweat by Bill Hayes during the month of January, which is a slightly odd, if I'm being completely honest, exercise science memoir hybrid in which the author looks at the concept of human beings moving our bodies for the sake of it through the lens of his own experiences and by looking at specific forms of exercise, such as running, boxing, swimming, even laughing, which I did think was a nice touch. This book had its interesting moments. I definitely learned a thing or two that I will take with me into the future, but as a book, I found it pretty disjointed. I have no idea what the author was trying to communicate besides, I find exercise interesting. And at one point later on in the book, he admits that he took a lot of time away from writing this book. It took him a long time to come back into the process. And unfortunately, it shows. So I don't know that I can really recommend this one. If you're looking for a good book about exercise, I would much sooner recommend Let's Get Physical by Danielle Friedman. Some of the things that Bill Hayes speaks about in Sweat are actually covered in Let's Get Physical, and overall I just found Let's Get Physical to be a much more enjoyable experience. I also had some conflicted feelings about I Am by Maggie O'Farrell, which is one of the 23 nonfiction books that I aim to read in 2023. This is a memoir in which the author catalogs a number of near-death experiences that she survived. She starts off the whole book by discussing how all of us, knowingly or unknowingly, have these moments when our lives could have been taken, but didn't. And then she starts telling the stories of hers, which most frequently were medical in nature, but sometimes they involved other people and dangerous situations. We'll start off with what I liked. I always like to do that. The writing in this book is beautiful, and I found that central concept really interesting to chew on. The idea that we all have these moments when our lives could continue or end. That was really interesting, and I don't think I've ever seen an author play with that idea before. I think it would be also really interesting to see that moved into the realm of fiction. If anyone has any suggestions of a writer who does that, I would love to read more about it because I thought the idea was very interesting. But frankly, reading this book was really bad for me. I don't consider myself to be an overly anxious person. I have anxieties like most people in the world do, but normally I find them manageable. I have found ways to manage my anxieties, and I normally know where they're coming from. If I'm feeling anxious, I can think back to what has happened to me over the past days or weeks and figure out what is causing me to feel anxious. While I was reading this book, I was finding it very challenging to separate the discomfort that this book was making me feel, because a lot of these stories are scary or would make me start to worry. It was really hard for me to start to get those feelings of anxiety from these stories and then go live my normal life without feeling that nagging, foreboding feeling that something bad was going to happen. It was really challenging to not just think about all the different ways that any of us could die at any time as I was going through this book. I didn't want to continue reading it because it was making me feel that way, but then I wanted to finish it. And then I would also start to feel dread about finishing this book. It was just really bad for me. I can't say I regret reading this because I don't. I thought her writing was beautiful. I would actually be interested in picking up one of her novels. If anyone has a suggestion of where I should start, I would love to hear it down in the comments. But I can tell you that I will be selling this copy to my local used bookstore because I think I would rather stick something sharp underneath my fingernails than reread this and go through all of that again. A much lighter read was my random pick of the month, May We Borrow Your Language by Philip Gooden. This is essentially a collection of little histories of words that entered the English language because of other languages. It moves chronologically, so you start out with the older words. A lot of those made their way into English because of what other nationalities were in or around the British Isles at the time, which I thought was really interesting. But then as you move forward in time, you feel the influence of pop culture, and then definitely in the more recent years, the influence of the internet. This book was so much fun. I learned so much about so many different words, things that I never would have guessed. Definitely great things to know for trivia night, which I always appreciate in a nonfiction book, but I don't like the way that I read it. I read it like a normal book, and it turns out that that was doing the book a disservice, which sounds strange, but reading it that way made it very choppy, very segmented. Each word gets its own little chapter, and then we move on immediately to the next one, next one, next one, next one. It's rapid fire. So if you're reading them back to back like that, I feel like you're much less likely to retain as much information as you want to about each one of those words. So I think if you're interested in this book, if you are a fellow word nerd who wants to learn more about the roots of these words, I would actually recommend you make this a nightstand book where you are slowly chipping away at this book, reading a little bit at a time, as opposed to reading it front to back like I did. But then the final two nonfiction books I read during the month of January shared a theme. They were both about penguins. First, there was My Penguin Year by Lindsay McCrae, which is a memoir of a wildlife cameraman who spent 11 months in Antarctica filming the entire breeding season of emperor penguins, and The Penguin Lessons by Tom Michel, which is the author's story of rescuing a charming Magellanic penguin in the 1970s when he was working as a teacher in Argentina. Both of these were so much fun to read, so immersive. I definitely recommend both of them, but I especially recommend The Penguin Lessons, which is particularly good on audiobook. If you want to hear why I think so, or if you just want to know what you can expect from either or both of these books, I did make an entire video in which I talked about both of them. I will link that for you in the description box below and up in the cards in case you missed it. So those were all of the January books that I managed to finish. I am admittedly still working on a couple of books for my January TBR as we're heading into February, and I also have a very ambitious February TBR that I'm trying to get through. We'll see how all of that goes. But as always, if you want to read any of the books I spoke about today, or if you've read them and you want to share your thoughts, I'd love to hear from you in the comment section below. Links to all the books I mentioned today, as well as any other links I may have promised you, will be linked for you in the description box below for your clicking convenience. If you're on a mobile device, just tap the title of this video and that box will expand for you. And at the bottom of that exact same description box, you'll see links to everywhere you can find me around the internet, like Goodreads and Instagram, the two places where I'm the most active, in case you would like to keep up with what I am reading and writing about right now. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.